Happy New Year. My resolutions for 2022 are to play more games and make more YouTube videos. You might have noticed it's been a while since my last one. With these goals in mind, I figured this might be a good opportunity to delve into the depths of my Steam library, pull out a bunch of games I've literally never played, and devote a bit of time to them. Not much time, mind you. My Steam backlog is shamefully vast, and if I spent more than a little while on each game, it'd take me a decade to make more than a dent in it. So I'm going to aim for an hour with each game, which should at least be long enough to form some basic judgments, and crucially, decide if it's worth coming back to at some point in the future. So, in this first episode, and if I end up making a regular habit of this, there'll be a hell of a lot of episodes, because I have a hell of a lot of games I haven't played, I'm going to stick with games I already have installed, just to save a bit of time. And first up, well, let me just have a quick look at my Steam library, sort by time played, pick something that looks interesting, and... Tooth and Tail. Okay, I don't specifically remember buying this one, but at time of writing it's on sale for $3, so I'm guessing at some time in the past I saw the distinctive art style and decided to buy it on that basis alone, given how cheap it must have been. So I really didn't know what to expect going in, but it turns out Tooth and Tail is a real-time strategy game with a few intriguing twists on the standard RTS formula. For one thing, instead of taking control of every unit on the battlefield, you only have direct control of one character, a general of sorts with no actual combat abilities of their own. This general can order other units to advance on their location or to retreat, and can build structures such as turrets or production facilities. It took me a bit of time to get used to this control scheme and to understand its limitations. Chief amongst these is the fact that if you want your units to move somewhere, you have to physically move there yourself first. You can also only select whether you want your entire army to move or all of a specific type of unit, so micromanagement feels a bit awkward and is also kind of limited. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is an RTS with relatively fast-paced gameplay, and once you get the hang of it, it's all quite streamlined and rather a lot of fun. I read one review that said this is one of the only RTSs to really be easy to play on a console, and although I was playing with mouse and keyboard, I totally get why having to direct just one main unit would be great if you're using a controller. Graphically, I think Tooth and Tail looks pretty fantastic. The pixel art is great, but so are the more detailed character portraits. And there really is a lot of character in this game. Between missions you can wander around your headquarters, conversing with a wide array of allies and associates from an equally wide array of species. The story, from what I've seen of it, actually seems pretty interesting too. There are several different factions with different ideologies, and most of the conflict seems to stem from arguments over who it's okay to eat, which I guess is predictable enough in a world of anthropomorphic animals. Disturbingly, the pigs don't seem to object to their place at the bottom of the food chain, but I'd be interested to see how this all develops. In my 1 hour's playtime, I just got up to the first mission where you play as the second of the factions, but there was already quite a variety in the missions, from your basic RTS builder-based missions to survival missions, and from fast-paced timed missions to ones where stealth and strategy are vital. Verdict. I have to point out that this is absolutely not a judgment on the actual game. This is just a verdict as to whether or not I think I'll bother playing it further. In this case, the answer is a yes, but with some reservations. I'm generally terrible at strategy games, I don't have the patience for them, so the fact that Tooth and Tail is relatively fast-paced is a point in its favour for me. But one of the things I like most about RTSs is being able to watch the entire battlefield unfold in a chaotic dance of death and explosions. Because you're locked onto the one character here, you can't really do that. But it's an undeniably fun game, it tries something different, the world building is surprisingly intriguing and it looks fantastic, so yeah, I can definitely see myself playing Tooth and Tail more fully. But I can also see myself getting distracted by, well, one of the hundreds of other games sitting in my backlog. Anyway, for now it's on to the next Unplayed game, which is... Toejam and Earl, Back in the Groove. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I never played either of the Toejam and Earl games on the Mega Drive. I wanted to, they looked kind of intriguing, but I never had the chance. And honestly, to this day I have no real idea what they're actually like. I think the second one was a 2D platformer, but from what little information I gleaned from games magazines back in the day, the first Toejam and Earl was some sort of basic roguelike. If that's true, and I could be way off the mark, this remake, Back in the Groove, has a lot more in common with the first game than the second. Certainly it looks a lot like a modern reimagining of the screenshots of the first Toejam and Earl that I saw in magazines. Apart from that though, I can't really comment on how similar or dissimilar this remake is. The game starts with a cutscene that is kind of cringy and kind of baffling. Who is Lamont? Why are we in his ship? Maybe this isn't a remake but rather a sequel, which is fine, but I'm not going to get the references. Oh well, my loss.
Look! Isn't that Earth right there? Wow, it's so big and so quiet.
Earl, crank up the megawatt speakers and let's lay some funk on these Earthlings.
Alright.
Let's punch the bass, Earl.
There's a tutorial on offer, and given I still have no real idea what this game is all about, that's an offer I'm going to accept. Okay, so I'm wandering around this green and pleasant land, shaking trees to find stuff, swimming in the water, drowning. Okay, apparently you can't swim very far. Take the elevator to the next level and it becomes apparent your aim is to find the 10 pieces of the spaceship that was obliterated in the opening cutscene. To do this you need to search islands populated by an array of wacky earthlings, some of whom are helpful but most of whom are irritatingly aggressive. There are loads of pickups, there's food to restore your health or take it away if it's the wrong sort of food, there's cash which can be exchanged for goods and services, and there are presents. Presents are arguably the main gameplay mechanic, as using them generally causes something significant to happen. Some of them are very useful power-ups, such as the sneakers that give you greatly increased speed. Some of them are annoying power-downs, like the one that just makes you fart at random intervals, stunning you briefly and making you vulnerable to enemy attack. With most of these presents you won't have any idea what they do, unless you find a friendly Earthling who's willing to identify them, for a fee. So chaos and hilarity often ensues when you open a present. Well, I say hilarity, that might be a bit too strong of a word. The game is definitely going for a humorous, wacky tone, and it basically succeeds. It is kind of amusing to see all the different Earthlings for the first time, and to experience the effects of some of the more bizarre presents. But I'm not sure there's enough here to sustain long-term interest. I finished the tutorial in about half an hour, which involved tracking down the 10 pieces of the ship in 10 different levels, and I enjoyed that experience a fair bit. But then I tried out the main game and I started having less fun. The maps here are bigger and they take a while to get around. There are secret pathways to be revealed, but they only appear when you get right up close to them, and there's no real way of telling where they are other than walking around the edge of each island, and you're never sure if you're going to be required to find them in order to progress. The biggest problem I found though, in my admittedly limited time with the game, is that the gameplay really is not very dynamic. All you can do is walk around, and quite slowly at that. You can't fight back against the hostile Earthlings unless you find a present that gives you a temporary attack ability, but none of the ones I found were at all effective. All I could really do was try to run away, and like I say, you can't really move very fast. All this adds up to a game that was getting rather boring by the end of the hour I spent with it. It was a bold choice to create a roguelike with very little real combat, but I'm not sure it was the right one. However, it does need to be pointed out that Back in the Groove is intended to be a multiplayer game, and maybe with 3 other people I would have had exponentially more fun. I'm not entirely convinced of that though. Verdict. I suspect the only way I'll ever play more of this game is if I somehow manage to find some other people who want to try out the multiplayer, and even then I can't imagine playing it for much longer than it takes to find out what, if anything, playing in multiplayer adds to the experience. Well, on to game number 3, which is Hylics. Hoo boy. Well, first things first, trying to run this game in full screen while recording crashed my computer, so I had to play it in a rather small window, and even that glitched out a bit, so I hope you don't mind the random glitchy arrow pointers at the top right. Sorry about that. But in a way, random weird glitches are kind of appropriate here because this is a random weird game, and I really do mean random. It starts with this absolutely nonsensical bit of text, and because the game crashed first time around, I know that it's apparently randomly generated, because this bit of nonsense is different to that first time. Still nonsense though, I think. Or maybe there's a hidden meaning behind it? And that's not the last time I'll be wondering if there are hidden meanings behind this game. Because Hylics is a game that seemingly delights in being weird and hard to fathom. I mean, just look at the artwork. It's so abstract it borders on the unintelligible. Despite that though, I like it, and not just because it's so outlandish. Weird for the sake of weird can only carry an art style so far, but this, in my opinion, has a definite appeal of its own. That said, your mileage may vary. If you find this just plain ugly, I can't really argue with that. At its core, Hylics is essentially a JRPG, although the J in that acronym has seldom been so inappropriate. In terms of basic gameplay and combat, there may be some similarities to Final Fantasy, but stylistically not so much. Nevertheless, like many a JRPG, you wander around town, talking to NPCs, search for loot, buy and sell equipment, and encounter enemies. Combat is turn-based, and the mechanics will be familiar to any JRPG veteran, even if the enemy designs are not. You pick your attack, you can use items or special abilities, your enemies respond in kind, there are status ailments, you probably know the sort of thing. Turns out I bit off more than I could chew with this battle, which was actually the first time I attempted combat. I got blinded and couldn't land any attacks, and I died pretty damn quick. I was getting ready to reload when I found myself in the afterlife, which in the world of Hylics apparently consists of a beachside castle populated by fish flopping about on the ground. You can restore your health here, and there are actually a couple of items to be found, including a TV set, which in this game is how you learn new abilities. You can also permanently increase your health using items you find in combat, so clearly you're supposed to die fairly regularly. Indeed, death really isn't such a handicap, as you can choose to resurrect at any of the crystals scattered around the world, so long as you've activated them in the first place. And I personally did die several times before I actually managed to successfully kill any enemies. Combat encounters are thankfully not random in Hylics, so they can often be avoided. And after a while I found someone willing to join my party, and killing enemies became a bit easier after that point. It became even easier a little while later when I found a third party member. Now, with a team of 3 plus a bunch of equipment and stat upgrades, I was able to kill what I assume was the first boss. In any case, it seemed to be the first mandatory combat encounter. And that was the end of Act 1, because apparently this game is split into acts. Conveniently, it took me almost exactly an hour to get this far, so I was able to leave the game there. It really felt like I accomplished quite a lot in that 1 hour. I explored a lot of different locations, I found a heap of items, recruited 2 new party members, killed a boss plus some other enemies, upgraded my stats a lot. As RPGs go, it's quite fast paced. It definitely helps that there's barely any dialogue, and most of what little there is makes zero sense anyway. Is there a story in this game? Is there any meaning at all? The only thing I really know about the whole world of Hylics is the name of a few of the characters, and of the main city. Nevertheless, I remain intrigued. Verdict. I definitely intend to come back and finish this one off, and maybe even do a proper review of it. According to howlongtobeat.com, a playthrough of the game should take about 3.5 hours, so I'm more than a quarter of the way there already. I can't exactly say I've been drawn into the game's narrative, as there isn't really one, but there's enough appeal and variety to the visual design that I'm eager to play more on that basis alone. Okay, next up, Game 4, which is the Hurricane of the Varstray Collateral Hazard. With a title like that, this game has to be one of two things. Either it's an anime-style Japanese fighting game, or it's an anime-style Japanese bullet hell game. As it happens, this time it's the latter. Although I do also have plenty of the former in my Steam backlog, so hopefully I'll get around to them at some point as well. For now though, it's time to descend into bullet hell. I have pretty mixed feelings about this type of game. On the one hand, I'm a simple man, and the appeal of a game with lots of shooting and explosions is as strong for me now as it was when I was 6 years old and watching someone play 1942 at the local fish and chip shop. On the other hand though, how much does a bullet hell game actually have to do with shooting? Not much, I'd argue. I mean, of course you do a lot of shooting. In fact, if your finger ever comes off the shoot button, you're probably doing something wrong. And sure, there are a hell of a lot of explosions. But really, bullet hell games are more about avoiding being shot than doing the shooting yourself. After all, the bullets of the genre title belong to your enemies, while the hell is yours. Ultimately, bullet hell games are about small, precise movements, and those are not my forte. But hey, I've got some enjoyment from them before in small quantities, so an hour of the Hurricane of the Varstray may not be such a bad thing. I start off with the story mode, and it quickly becomes apparent that the narrative of this game is going to be just as baffling as it was in Hylics, albeit for a very different reason. The English translation is not great. I've been slow of understanding, chicken, then I've always slow everyone down. Only Miho has been together with me, but that didn't change myself at all, and it still does. Almost Shakespearean, isn't it? From what I can gather, the story involves a group of teenage girls piloting spaceships loaded with enough firepower to demolish a solar system. In other words, it's pretty much identical to every other Japanese sci-fi game ever made. And maybe the story is fantastic. I honestly doubt it, but I can't be sure because the English translation is just such a mess. Gameplay wise though, it seems solid enough, but I need to stress that I'm no expert on these sorts of games. It seems to me the gameplay can be split into two main elements, the boss fights and the bits leading up to the boss fights. In the main sections of the levels, before the boss appears, you mow down thousands of enemies who shoot thousands of projectiles at you. It's almost impossible to avoid getting hit here, but you have a shield that recharges almost instantly, so it doesn't matter. Then, when the boss shows up, the shield stops recharging, so now you need to be really careful. Fortunately, the bosses tend to shoot fewer projectiles in more recognisable patterns, and this is what a bullet hell game is really all about, as far as I understand it. It certainly seems to be where most of the fun and challenge is, and the bits where you're not fighting a boss seem kind of pointless, given how tough it is to die. Well, tough in the early levels at least. I managed to do it plenty of times by the end. Fortunately, the story mode gives you infinite continues, so nothing was going to stop me from reaching the game's incomprehensible ending. I think my character sacrificed herself to save the universe, or something. It might have been quite emotional if I'd been able to understand more of what was going on. Seems unlikely though. With the story mode done, I give the arcade mode a try, and it seems to be pretty much identical to the story mode, just without the baffling plot. It also seems to give you infinite continues, but I'm on a time limit here, and I've got just enough time left to try out the 5-minute survival mode. I managed to get the world's 459th highest score, and although I have no idea how many people there are on this leaderboard, I'm going to assume I'm somewhere near the bottom. And that's all the time I have for the Hurricane of the Varstray. Verdict. I do enjoy bullet hell games, but only occasionally and for extremely short periods. Mostly I just don't have the patience. So I doubt I'll be spending too much more time with this game, but it does seem like one of the better examples of the genre on Steam, so maybe in a year or two when the urge strikes me, I might load it up for another little taste of hell. Okay, on to the final game, which is Infinifactory. Now here's a game that I've been meaning to play for ages. I only really know the basics of what it's all about. It's a puzzle game where you need to get things from one place to another, there are conveyor belts, that's about it really. I certainly didn't know there was any sort of narrative to it, but apparently you're a guy, an engineer by the looks of it, who's abducted by aliens. These aliens set about testing your problem-solving skills, which also serves as the game's tutorial. And then you're locked in a small room, given some food pellets, and presented with a screen which you use to choose your next task. Naturally enough, these start off simple. In the first one, you just need to use conveyor belts to transport 3 different types of item from where they drop out of the wall to the correct receptacle. This one actually took me quite a while longer than it perhaps should have, because it took me a bit to figure out the rules for how the conveyor belt sections attach to each other and how they're affected by gravity. The second puzzle introduces the necessity of welding items together, and again it's fairly basic stuff that still took me a while to properly understand. The third puzzle requires you to weld 3 items together, which necessitates the use of standard non-conveyor belt blocks to get everything to line up properly. Once again, this took me a surprisingly long time, and I'm not sure my solution was the most efficient or most effective one. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, once you finish a puzzle, you're shown how you did compared to the rest of the world in 3 different metrics. It also shows you how you compare to your Steam friends who have played the game. I've only got 2 of them, apparently, but the fact that both of them consistently did better than me was kinda demoralising. Anyway, you probably get the general concept of the game. It's block puzzles that require a high degree of logic and spatial reasoning. I'm not particularly good at these things. I used to think I was, but then I played games like Steven's Sausage Roll and realised that I'm only a step or 2 above a drooling moron. And that's only because I don't drool. Well, not much. Fact is, this game hurts my brain, like genuine discomfort in my frontal lobes. I do love puzzle games in theory, Lemmings remains one of my all-time favourites, but I'm afraid these days I just do not have the mental dexterity required for them. I still feel the satisfaction when I figure out a tough puzzle, but mostly the brain strain is too much for me. So I muddled my way through a few more puzzles. This one requires you to weld 3 items together in a slightly more complex pattern, and it took me ages, relatively speaking. And that one was still in the first tier of puzzles, the super basic ones to get you started. With those done, the aliens handed me a trophy and dumped me back to my room. The first couple puzzles in the second tier introduced pushes that nudge items in a given direction, and sensors that are triggered by items passing in front of them, and can be wired up to specific pushes. Now I truly felt like my brain was reaching its limits, and so near the start of the game too. I would swear my brain used to work better than this back when it was young and flexible. And that was my hour up. Well, I'll be totally honest, I still had a few minutes on the clock, but I loaded up this next level, stared at it blankly for 30 seconds, and decided that my feeble mind needed a break. I hope that's forgivable. Verdict. This seems like a good game. From what little I've seen, the puzzles are well designed, and I suspect that 20 years ago I might have found them truly compelling. But these days, I wasn't joking about the brain strain that even these simple puzzles caused me. Sure, I got through them all with a bit of effort, but it really was an effort. Possibly that's a sign my brain needs more exercise, and maybe Infinifactory would be a good way of getting it, so hopefully I'll come back to it when my brain feels a bit more energetic. Sadly, I'm not entirely sure that will ever happen. Okay, there you have it. 5 games taken from my Steam backlog that are unplayed no longer. Even if I never come back to them, I feel I've at least given them a chance. So that's 5 down, hundreds to go. Well, thanks for watching. This is the first video I've uploaded in a while. Sorry about that. I've been pretty busy and motivation has been lacking, but I do intend to keep the channel going into the new year. I'm just not sure what form it'll be taking. I might be a bit more random with the types of videos I upload, try to shake things up a bit, keep things interesting, for me at least. No idea if I'll be successful with that, but hopefully you'll stick with me. Anyway, until next time, get off my lawn.